Hello. Thanks for joining me for another class in Fortifying Your Faith. Been looking at ways to build up our faith, to encourage us, to give us reasons for believing in God and for believing in the Bible, for believing in Christianity. Because you don't have to park your brains at the door to be a Christian. There's great evidences to show us that being a Christian really makes sense. Well, last week I did a book review, and I thought I would do the same thing today. There are so many wonderful books that help us, encourage us, and I wanted to share with you one that I've more recently read and that I gained quite a bit from it. It's called Stealing from God by Frank Turret. Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need to Make Their Case. Why atheists need God to make their case. So, stealing from God. It doesn't have anything to do with tithing. It has to do with why atheists need God to make their case. He had a previous book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, and this is the follow-up book. And, I could look at every chapter of this book and have a class on those chapters. But there's so much complex reasoning, and this is certainly not my expertise, my area of expertise. And so I thought it would be better just to do a review of the entire book and give you a chance to take a look at it and see if it's something you might be interested in. I guess the theory behind this is I can either give you some fish or I can teach you how to fish. And I prefer to show you how to fish, show you where the good stuff is and what you can do with it. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at this book, Stealing from God. Now, Frank Turret, by the way, if you go online, you can find him. He's prevalent on YouTube. He has a YouTube station called Cross-Examined. He has his own page, crossexamined.org, and I'd recommend those to you. You could go to crossexamined.org, and he's got all kinds of resources and classes and materials. You can explore this much further. And his sites are just loaded with resources. So I would recommend him to you. You could find some really good stuff here. And he seems to be a really sharp guy. Now, the foreword in the book was written by Ravi Zacharias. Now, if you're familiar with Ravi Zacharias, you know him to be quite an articulate man and had very many good arguments for believing in God. Unfortunately, Zacharias passed away this year. But if you are able, you might look up Ravi Zacharias on YouTube, and I'm sure you will be very interested in what he has to say. Well, let's take a look at this book. In the introduction, he pretty well answers the question, why this book? Why write this book? And it's really a response to what we refer to as the new atheist. Now, the old atheists, they didn't believe in God, but they weren't as militant as the new atheists are. And that's what we talk about, the new atheists. They're very militant. They're trying to destroy Christianity. And he begins by giving us some examples here in the introduction. He says, Richard Dawkins wields the sword of science to declare that anyone who believes in God is deluded. He writes in his bestseller, The God Delusion, when one person suffers from a delusion, it's called insanity. When many people suffer from a delusion, it is called religion. If this book works as intended, religious readers who open it will be atheists when they put it down. According to Dawkins, advances in our understanding of evolution make belief in God obsolete. Darwin got rid of God as an explanation for the apparent design of life, and science will one day get rid of God as an explanation for the apparent creation and design of the universe. Since Dawkins believes natural laws can't be broken, he is incredulous that anyone could believe in miracles. In fact, he called anyone who believes in creation ignorant, stupid, or insane. But it's not just believers in God who are wicked. According to Dawkins, God himself is wicked. Dawkins writes, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynist, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniac, sadomasochist, and capriciously malevolent bully. With that perspective on God, it's no wonder that Dawkins claims that teaching religion to your children is child abuse. And if that kind of God really exists, why would you worship him? And so he's talking about Dawkins. He talks about Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, talks about others who are in this camp of what we call the new atheist, who are very aggressive coming out against Christianity. Now, in this introduction, he also talks about stealing from God and what he means by stealing from God. Here he is. He says, what I mean is atheists are using aspects of reality to argue against God that wouldn't exist if atheism were true. In other words, when atheists give arguments for the atheistic worldview, they are stealing from a theistic worldview to make their case. In effect, they are stealing from God in order to argue against him. And because he says these are crimes, he's using this play on words, and so he uses this acrostic, CRIMES, and these are going to be the topics he goes over: causality, reason, information and intention, morality, evil, and science. He says, it's my true contention that these crimes not only help show that theism is true, but that the foundational assumptions of atheism make it impossible to make a sound intellectual case for atheism. If atheism is true, there's no way to know it with any confidence. In fact, if atheism is true, there's no way to know anything with any confidence. Well, before he ends his introduction, beginning here, he talks about who is the God you don't believe in. And he begins to talk about the God of the Bible in contrast to that. And so there's these biblical traits of God. In fact, a very good section on God and his qualities and characteristics. Here it's all in the introduction. So he ends the introduction with these words. All righty. Oh, here it is. He says, I need to make one style point and one content point. First, the style point. We are going to be reviewing several personal interactions and debates that I and other theists have had with atheists. That's not intended to convey the notion that we theists are all smarter than atheists. There are smart people on both sides of the debate. I have great respect for the intellects of atheists such as Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and the late Christopher Hitchens. I'm sure in many areas they are, or were, far more knowledgeable than I am. As someone once said, we're all ignorant, just in different subjects. When it comes to God, however, I think that their worldview assumptions are flawed and their arguments don't work, as many others have noted. The debates and interactions will also breathe life into what could be difficult subject matter, and they will help us get the heart of the disagreements between theist and atheist. Not the content. Now the content point. We are going to be covering some complex issues in a relatively brief way. Much more could be said than I'll have room to say. I can already hear critics of this book dismissing it because I didn't address such and such a point by an atheist, or because I don't have an advanced degree in each of these areas. Does anyone? However, one doesn't need to be a specialist in every field, nor does one need to evaluate every atheistic theory to see that atheism has fatal flaws. If you've ever built a house, you'll see what I mean. When we built an addition on our house, I was amazed how many specialists were needed. After the foundation guy, a series of specialty contractors came in. I can't remember the exact order, but we had the framing guy and the roof guy and the brick guy and the siding guy and the window guy and the electrical guy and the plumbing guy and the insulation guy and the heating AC guy and the drywall guy, the trim guy, the floor guy and the tile guy and the light guy, the fireplace guy, the paint guy, and the inspector. The inspector didn't need to understand the detailed workmanship of each of these specialists in order to spot fatal flaws in the foundation. In fact, if there were a fatal flaw in the foundation, it wouldn't matter how good the workmanship was above it, the entire structure would soon collapse. Atheism is like a house with fatal flaws in its foundation. Most of the atheistic views we'll be addressing are faulty due to some overlooked mistake in logic, or due to the fact that those views could only be supported if theism were true. The most common logical mistake we'll see is that atheists violate the law of non-contradiction. They put forth a theory about reality that is supposed to be universal, but then they exempt themselves from it. Most atheists don't see these mistakes precisely because they are specialists focused on details in the house. They are not trained to spot more basic flaws as inspectors are. In fact, not being a specialist can help one see faulty assumptions and more general mistakes missed by those too close to the details. As the saying goes, if you want to know what the water is like, don't ask the fish. So you don't need to be a specialist in every field to spot problems. You just need a good inspector of the foundation of every field. And the foundation of every field is philosophy, not the kind of philosophy where you sit around pondering inane questions like, do I really exist? But the kind of philosophy that tries to discover what reality actually is and how it works in light of every aspect of human experience. Does atheism best account for every aspect of human experience, not just material things we can touch, but also immaterial truths we perceive, such as logic, love, justice, morality, and consciousness? If we use the tools of philosophy, including logic and good reasoning skills, I think we'll see that atheism can account for very little of what we experience. Atheistic materialism lacks power and scope to explain reality. We'll also see that the assumptions foundational to atheism are irrevocably flawed. With a flawed foundation, the entire superstructure of atheism comes crashing down. No future scientific discoveries or elaborate theorizing will rescue it. A house built on the sand of illogic is a goner. The intellectual crime of atheists begin with their views of the law essential to all science and knowledge, the law of causality. So let's start there. Now, the interesting thing about this book is not only does he explain these reasons for believing in God, but he goes out and he really attacks the arguments of the atheists. This is one of those books that really goes out against this new atheism and some of the claims they're making and saying, you know what, you couldn't even make these claims unless there was a God. And he begins here in chapter 1 with the law of causality. He said, no one created something out of nothing. That's a question. To doubt the law of causality is to doubt virtually everything we know about reality, including our ability to reason and do science. All arguments, all thinking, all science, and all aspects of life depend on the law of causality. The very nature of science is asking the cause and effect questions and seeing the cause and effects of certain things. And so we're asking who or what caused the universe. The atheists say, well, hey, if we were given enough time and, science will finally come up with a natural explanation for the universe. Well, they haven't yet. They claim that someday they will. They don't know how the universe began. And the one thing they will not accept as the beginning of the universe is God. because you need to realize that this is their world view. To allow God into the conversation, to allow an intellectual creator to come into the picture would automatically cause them to cease to be atheists. So that's the one thing they cannot do. Now, on page 27 of his book, and I'm going to have to go quite rapidly through these things. He says here, this created and fine-tuned universe, along with the orderly cause and effect nature of reality, are best explained by an intelligent being with attributes remarkably congruent to the God of the Bible. There's more evidence for this conclusion in the following chapters, but that evidence and conclusion are only sound if all effects have causes. If the law of causality doesn't hold, if effects can arise without causes, then how can atheists or theists have confidence in any of their theories about the past? Now, one of the best parts of this book to me is that I'm introduced to a guy named Dr. John Lennox. John Lennox is a mathematical professor, I think, at Oxford, and he's a prominent Christian. And he talks about his debate in here. I forget. He's debating Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins, by the way, is not a very good debater, but that's another story. But John Lennox, by the way, and this is what I would encourage you to do. I went on YouTube to look up John Lennox, and there's many discussions he has with atheists. I looked at the one he had with Atkins. There is another YouTube station called Unbelievable. It's from a program called Unbelievable out of England. And what this show does is basically put people who are believers with unbelievers, the theist with atheists, and allows them to each discuss their point of view. It's not an argument. It's not so much a debate as it is a discussion. The guy who moderates these conversations does an excellent job. But when you take a look and hear John Lennox, you think, man, this guy is a great thinker. He is really sharp. And he is such a laid-back guy. I mean, he's just a really neat person. And so I'd encourage you to look him up. I was just glad I got introduced to him in this book. And so there's many more things that I could say about this chapter of causality. I just barely skimmed over it, and that's all I'm going to be able to do with any of these chapters, really. I'd encourage you to look up this idea of causality. You can look up his information on YouTube or on his site, or just pick up the book and read it. I think you'll enjoy it. It's not that difficult to read, although it can be kind of technical at times. Now, chapter 2 is the chapter on reason. Bad religion or bad reason. The main point of this chapter is not to show that all arguments for atheism fail. The main point of this chapter is to show that all arguments for anything fail if atheism is true. And this comes back from the idea again that really for atheists to make an argument, they have to have reason. And reason comes from God. This is the whole thing. The laws of logic are grounded in the nature of God. And atheists must steal logic from God to try to make any of the arguments. And so he goes through this in quite a bunch of detail. He talks about a debate that he had with an atheist and the discussion between that came out of that. And then just makes many points as he goes along. In chapter 3 of the book, chapter 3, the title is Information and Intentionality. In him all things hold together. God's signature is not just in the cell, it's in all of creation. God is as necessary to the universe as a band is to music. Once the band stops playing, the music is over. He begins here, I once read an atheist online who was complaining that there was not enough evidence to believe in God. When a Christian asked him what kind of evidence he would need to believe The atheist said he would believe if he looked up right now and saw written in the sky, "Hey, Roger, this is God. I certainly do exist. Now stop all your whining down there." Since the immediacy of such a message would rule out a skywriter, that message could be good evidence for God. Roger certainly couldn't explain that away as a chance collection of cloud material or an unusual cloud formation, nor would he say that given enough time the clouds could form that way naturally due to the kind of cloud evolution. Any message like that had to be the product of intelligence. Why? Because natural laws don't create information-rich messages like, "Hey, Roger, this is God." In all our experience, the only forces we see creating informational messages are intelligent minds. Natural forces never do it. Well, then he goes on to talk about the information-rich DNA molecule, and he begins to talk about that. And on page 59, he says, "But couldn't the first code be simple and then mutate into the longer codes we see now? The problem is that even a simple information-rich sequence like, 'Hey, Roger, this is God,' requires intelligence. And so-called simple life has a code much longer than that. Indeed, Richard Dawkins admits that the amount of information in a one-celled life, like an amoeba, has as much information in its DNA as 1,000 Encyclopedia Britannicas. Now, believing that 1,000 encyclopedias came into existence without any intelligent intervention is like believing that an entire bookstore resulted from an explosion in a printing shop. I don't have enough faith to believe that. You remember last week the book Tactics also used the same illustration because DNA is the very basic building block of life. And DNA just has so much information, so much sequenced, intelligent information. It could not have happened by chance. And so he's going to talk about this information and intentionality. That there's intention in all things around us. On page, one of the things here, nature seems to continually be moving forward with a purpose, with continuality, with intentionality. The acorn, is going to eventually, if it lives, become an oak tree. We see this information and we see this intentionality, we see this purpose in all the things around us. And the universe shows such an intelligent being behind it all. So that's this section on chapter 3. Chapter 4 is really interesting. And it is a chapter on morality. Stealing rights from God. He says you can know what a book says while denying there's an author, but there would be no book to know unless there was an author. Likewise, atheists can know objective morality while denying God exists, but there would be no objective morality unless God exists. Objective morality. If all we are is a bunch of molecules, then there would be no morality. On page 97, he says morality isn't made of molecules. What does justice weigh? What is the chemical composition of courage? How much hydrogen is in the honesty molecule? Did Hitler just have bad molecules? These are absurd questions because moral standards aren't made of molecules. Now the atheist can come back and say, well, but I have a morality. Yes, but it's not based on any objective standard. Only God chose us an objective standard. An atheist just has a morality based upon society or on his own preferences or what he wants. In fact, when he says, when atheists say, is this a part of society's standards? You can ask, whose society is it? What about Hitler? That's why Hitler said, I'm going to create a better society. Where only white people, white Aryans are here. We're going to get rid of all these Jews, and we're going to kill all these people. That was his morality because it was not based on a objective morality. In fact, the Nuremberg trials later on that tried the Nazi leadership was based on the idea that there was an objective morality. And so this is a really good, very interesting chapter. I really encourage you to look at this chapter. It was perhaps the most interesting for me anyway. On page 111 and following, he says, when I sense hostility during the Q&A period of I don't have enough faith to be an atheist presentation, I normally ask the question, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? On several occasions, I've had atheists yell back at me, no. No. Wait, you claim to be a beacon of reason, yet when I ask you if something were true, would you believe it? You say no. How is that reasonable? It's not. That's because reason or evidence isn't the issue for such people. They don't have an intellectual objection to Christianity. They have an emotional, moral, or volitional objection. They've been hurt by Christians or think they've been let down by God, but more often, as several atheists have admitted, they simply don't want to give up their autonomy and submit their will to God. Well, that says quite a bit right there. Now, I'm running out of time, and if I go too long, YouTube won't allow me to post this, so let me just kind of finish as best I can. Chapter 5 is about evil. And this is a really good one because so many atheists claim that God in the Bible is evil. And you kind of ask, well, who said God was evil? What is evil? What do they mean by that? You go back to Tekis. What do you mean by that? And how did you come to that conclusion? C.S. Lewis, who most of us are familiar with, he was once an atheist. And it says C.S. Lewis was once an atheist who thought evil disproved God. But he later realized that he was stealing from God in order to argue against him. He wrote, as an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? What makes something evil? He's going to talk about the evil in a religion. And sometimes we hear people talk about, the evil in the Bible. And he's going to address that. And he addresses it a very interesting way. I may come back and talk about this later because I think he does a good job. Chapter 6, he talks about science. Then chapter 7, the 4-point case for mere Christianity. He pretty well sums up the book, goes over each chapter and gives the highlights of those chapters. There's a great section here on the historical reliability of the New Testament. And then chapter 8 is his conclusion. And he talks about the concept of hell. And his basic point is that God does not send people to hell. People choose whether to believe in God or not. Well, this is the book, Stealing from God. I don't know if I've given a good review or not, but it's been interesting for me to read this book, and I think you might find it interesting. It's one of the great perks of being a preacher, I'll tell you. Preaching is not always easy, but one of the things I have to admit that I really enjoy is I get to read a lot of books. I get to look at a lot of resources. And I hope over the weeks I can share some of those with you, some that have been important to me, and I hope will be important to you in fortifying your faith, in building you up. That's what I want to do. Well, I hope you have a good week. I will see you next week for another class. Hopefully I talk to most of you on Sunday. So we'll see you then.